So with that, I'm handing it over to Elizabeth Agro so she can introduce our keynote speaker.
So this portion of our symposium, we're going to be focusing on crafting dissent, and our keynote speaker is Hinda Mandell. The Crafting Dissent keynote and panel led by Hinda celebrates the power of craft as a change agent, an expressive form of media, and as a political tool. Book Crafting Dissent, Handicraft as Protest from the American Revolution to the Pussyhats, from which this panel is drawn, demonstrates how makers have used craft throughout history, typically involving the manipulation of yarn, thread, and fabric to resist governmental policy and societal norms. The panel will consist of 8 contributors to the book and makers whose work challenges social structures and explores the following questions, among others. Why do people choose craft as a means to channel their activism? Can craft as activism actually move the needle forward on social progress? And how does the process of making connect people to their histories and traditions? So remember to put your questions in the chat along with your name and where you're joining us from so that we can share them with everyone at the conclusion of this part of our presentation. We ask everyone attending to turn off their video feed now as we begin the second half of our presentation. And here, Hinda. Hinda is Associate Professor in the School of Communication at RIT in New York and is editor of Crafting Dissent, Handicraft as Protest from the American Revolution to Pussyhats, is co-author and co-editor of Crafting Democracy, Fiber Arts and Activism, published by RIT in 2019, and co-editor of Nasty Women and Bad Hombres, Gender and Race in the 2016 US presidential election, published in 2018. She's also the author of Sex Scandals, Gender and Power in Contemporary American Politics, and co-editor of Scandal in a Digital Age, published by Palgrave in 2016. Her research has been funded by the Center for Craft and also Fiber Art Now. She fundraised for the first known public art installation of Anne Murray Douglas in Rochester, New York, who was married to Frederick Douglass. Mandell's website is omghinda.com, and she's on Instagram. Mandell is passionate about organizing crowd-created yarn installations in public spaces connected to the history of a region's social reform movements. And Hinda, please join us, and I hope everyone will enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was a fabulous conversation between Rose B. Simpson and Karen Patterson. That was fantastic. So here I go. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm so glad to be joining you today. I extend my gratitude to symposium organizers, including Layla Cartier, Elizabeth Agro, and Jennifer Zwilling, Lindsay Nevin, and Linnea West. The title of my talk is Craft as Action and Self-Insertion in the Trump Era. I want to preface my remarks by something I say to my students when they conduct a textual analysis. I say you have to have an identity paragraph so people understand who the person is who's doing the interpretation. I won't offer you an identity paragraph due to time constraints, but I will offer you this sentence. My first full-time job was as a journalist, so I feel very comfortable with self-insertion, maybe too comfortable. And that's why it's important, because now I'm an academic, to problematize that which feels as comfortable to me as a worn blanket. So here we go. And if you wouldn't mind, first slide, please, or the next slide, please. Thank you. What role does yarn play as the apparatus in the democratic toolbox, especially as a device responding to immense harm in the Trump era? Why would a group of people turn to yarn as a mechanism for change in the face of bodily violence, terror, murder? How can a material as pliable, voiceless, but not expressionless, domestic and delicate be useful as an agent for positivity, caring, strength, even change? These are questions I've asked myself since the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, when a gunman interrupted a prayerful Shabbat morning 2 years ago in October 2018 and murdered 11 congregants. I asked these questions again this fall of 2020 in my adopted hometown of Rochester, New York, when the public learned that back in March, upon responding to a mental health duress call, Rochester police pinned a naked Black man to a snowy street, put a spit hood over his head, performed a plank position on his head, killing him. The man's name was Daniel Prude. Rochester residents took to the streets in nightly protests when the cover-up of this police killing became public in early September this year. Police response to the thousands of marchers in Rochester was violent, with the city's acting police chief admitting that his force deployed 6,000 pepper balls against peaceful protesters within the first 3 nights of protest in September. A colleague at my university, who attended every one of the protesting events for weeks in Rochester, and I organized a city hall event we called Yarn Over Police Brutality, where we crafted in support of local Black Lives Matter organizers, known as Free the People Rock. We occupied space in solidarity with them on City Hall steps as we supported calls for the mayor's resignation. We brought yarn to share, and some attendees taught Rochester City students who are in middle school and high school how to knit and crochet, giving them skeins of yarn, hooks, and needles to help build their craft stash at home. Their hands alternated between their yarn and their keyboards, since the students were attending Zoom classes while sitting on City Hall steps. But why yarn? The purpose of this talk is to frame yarn in a 4-year period of national catastrophe as a tool for solace and collective action. This talk will focus on the domestic terrorism that occurred in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, since the Rochester work I just mentioned is still unfolding. Next slide, please. Thank you. As a Jewish yarn enthusiast, my response to the Tree of Life attack in Pittsburgh was immediate and visceral. I picked up my crochet hook and began casting on stitches to form a plush Jewish star. And within days of the synagogue attack, I co-formed Jewish Hearts for Pittsburgh with New Yorker Ellen Dominus Browdy, a Facebook craft campaign with 1,300 members, which ultimately delivered 2,500 Jewish hearts to the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of the attack in November 2018. We worked fast and furiously in the weeks following the Pittsburgh shooting, regarded as the deadliest attack against the American Jewish community in its history. And 2 weeks before Hanukkah in 2018, 40 local volunteers, mostly from Pittsburgh, hung these representations of love and peace on tree branches, on fences, around fire hydrants, street signs, and inside businesses within the afflicted neighborhood. While my enthusiasm for this project has been unwavering, questions about activism still linger in its wake, even as this project has been featured in an academic book and a mainstream media book as part of the exhibition Crafting Democracy and in a number of articles. Why did a group of mostly women turn to yarn as the antidote to a heinous act of hate in Pittsburgh? The arts scholar Julia Bryan Wilson writes in her book Fray, quote, "Textile making is often represented iconically as a stand-in both for tradition and for defiance against the reigning order." The reigning order during Donald Trump's presidency has been a barrage of nationalistic vitriol and hatred aimed at those who do not share the racial, national, ethnic ability, sexual orientation, religious, economic, and normative, quote, normative background as Trump. Within this violent morass of the past 4 years, I situate this group of crafters who see handwork as a mechanism for solace and as an opportunity for them to take a stand against this apparent reigning order of hate and its violent impacts. While a robust body of scholarly literature has emerged to examine the impacts of craft-based activism, less has been written about craft action as a direct response to bodily violence and mass shootings. For this reason, it's worth lingering on a 2016 journal article titled Race and Responses to Violence in Prayer Shawl Ministries by the theologian Donna Bauman. She argues at the heart of such craft work is a community's response to grief after a violent act. Craft in these instances is at once self-serving and deeply empathic, self-involved and thoughtful, kind and burdensome. The impetus to craft and gift the handwork to those terrorized as a direct response to violence is an act of sustaining love and also self-serving, according to Donna Bauman. She writes, quote, acts of sympathy are ways of demonstrating to ourselves that we are not accomplices to what causes suffering, but they also proclaim, perhaps all unawares, our impetus in the face of it. We cannot escape our kinship to those in mourning. We can only try to deal with it. In circumstances of disastrous violence and loss of life, this heightened awareness of this condition of being undone by each other, as Judith Butler puts it, leads many people to seek some sort of self-insertion, end quote. Bauman also quotes the philosopher Susan Sontag's book, Regarding the Pain of Others. Sontag argues that people, in this case crafters, seek stability during peaks of unsettling violence through the call to do something, in this case charitable crafting, as an effort to mend a solution and secure closure that to the victims' families and survivors of mass shootings, there is no such neat fix. The philosopher Judith Butler rhetorically asks, what happens when outsider consumers of violence sit with their discomfort and anxiety, as opposed to busying their hands with a solution? Butler writes, quote, if we stay with the sense of loss, are we left feeling only passive and powerless, as some might fear? Or are we rather returned to a sense of human vulnerability, to our collective responsibility for the physical lives of one another? End quote. In classic Yiddish style, I answer a question with a question. What if self-insertion through craft is a collective effort to claim communal care for the lives of those afflicted by violence? Craftivist godmother Betsy Greer has written, quote, sometimes people ask if craft can save the world. In the short run, maybe not, end quote. I say it's important to match claims with outcomes. Those engaged in craft action do not generally claim that their handwork is the solution. An analysis of 113 letters that are in my archive at my university, which were written by Jewish Hearts for Pittsburgh members, reveals that craft action is not even regarded as a solution to violence, but rather as a response. If we frame craft-based action as a response rather than a solution, and frame the response to violence as a continuum with myriad possibilities, we can situate craft-based movement as an action that taps into the human need for kindness and support in the face of catastrophe. In response to the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, Judith Butler wrote the essay collection called Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence. She writes, quote, our lives are profoundly implicated in the lives of others, end quote. I ask, if we are bound up in the actions of others, what is our responsibility to respond to cataclysmic events? While Butler is clear that assailants are responsible for the destruction they have wrought, she also argued that, quote, we would be making a mistake if we reduce their actions to purely self-generated acts of will or symptoms of individualism, end quote. To cast the assailant, whether a lone wolf gunman or members of a police department, as a moral failure forecloses on the necessary self-reflection of the collective's role in the formation of individual acts of violence against a group. Butler continues to ask, quote, how is it that radical violence becomes an option? Our acts are not self-generated, but conditioned. We are at once acted upon and acting, and our responsibility lies in the juncture between the two. What can I do with the conditions that form me? What do they constrain me to do? What can I do to transform them? End quote. For the participants in the Jewish Hearts for Pittsburgh project, as expressed through 113 letters that we received from crafters, crafting Jewish hearts allowed them to stitch love in a way that was meaningful to them from the comforts of their home. For one Jewish hearts crafter, who is also a survivor of perhaps one of the most iconic school shootings, the Columbine High School Massacre of 1999, the act of crafting her own Jewish heart was a way to pay forward the kindness she received back in 1999. She writes, quote, "I know from personal experience that small and simple acts of kindness can help heal. When I was 17 in 1999, I was a junior at Columbine High School. One April day, my life changed forever. I was devastated, but then letters and small tokens of love came pouring in. Each letter or token gave me strength to keep going. I hope I can pass on some of the strength I was given," end quote. As Judith Butler wrote, quote, "Only once we have suffered that violence are we compelled ethically to ask how we will respond to violent injury. What role will we assume in the historical relay of violence? Who will we become in the response? And will we be furthering or impeding violence by virtue of the response that we make?" End quote. Grief, added Butler, lays bare the social relations that hold together human connections and strips away at, quote, "the very notion of ourselves as autonomous and in control," end quote. Yet another benefit of crafting as a response to mass shootings is restoring a sense of control through repetition of stitch by stitch, of selecting colors and yarn and patterns. And while the sense of control may indeed be an illusion, it can bring stability as a mechanism of working through fear and anxiety. Craft as a response to high-profile mass shootings does not cure problems, but can restore a sense of humanity through the connections it helps establish with others, by affirming the productive process of making and bringing the maker into a spiritual alignment of self that is centered on self-reflection. In this way, craft may serve as an antidote to the vulnerability that violence brutally rips bare. It is a response to violence that has restorative and transformative functions throughout the length of a person's engaged participation in the craft making act, functions that are amplified through a sense of community. Handcraft born out of pain tells communities, "I see you and ache for you." According to David Gauntlet, the author of the book, Making is Connecting, quote, "People often spend time creating things because they want to feel alive in the world as participants rather than as viewers, and to be active and recognized within a community of interesting people," end quote. A Jewish hearts crafter from Illinois wrote, quote, "Elie Wiesel said, 'The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference.' My wish is that these hearts will show the Jewish community we stand with them, regardless of different religious backgrounds, and we will not be silent when love demands action," end quote. The Jewish Hearts for Pittsburgh letters offer a testament to the confluence of craft and memory through the body of a collective. The act of making can be both a solitary and a social enterprise, but it is critical to situate craft as a collective act that reaches across time into the past and acts as a bridge to the future. Most obviously, the time craft mechanism is at play through the passage of skills from an older craftsperson to a younger one, or through the gifting of a material good that is worn, kept, displayed, and passed down over a number of years. But in less obvious ways, to engage in craft is to reflect on one's relationships, to take trips down memory's lane, to imagine more peaceful, aspirational futures, to engage in self-soothing behavior, to think fondly and sadly of family and friends, present and past. Crafting in the wake of violence is reflective and collective and tied intimately to the memories of the maker. It offers the pathway to intrinsic transfiguration with the hope for extrinsic benefit. Therefore, while crafting in the aftermath of gun violence may involve self-insertion, It would be disparaging, too simplistic, and even dehumanizing to degrade the process of crafting as self-serving, full stop. It is a collective act that is foundational to a genuine human need for connection, reflection, doing, making, communing, and sharing. The goal is to do so sensitively and with the well-being of the intended recipients in mind. It is clear that a craft campaign born out of love and compassion should not add to the material objects that arrive at a site afflicted by gun violence in an acute attack. It is important for members of the stricken community to be and feel involved so that the craft intervention is not merely being done on their behalf, but so they too can engage in the positive effects of community crafting if they choose. In concluding, why yarn? At its best, craft as a response to violence exists in concert with other concurrent acts of activism occurring during the crisis. But the Pittsburgh case offered a unique opportunity for crafters to connect their own histories, recollections, and experiences with the afflicted space through embodied practice. In such a process, craft as action becomes memory making and memory tapping in practice. Therefore, it may be helpful to shift our thinking about craft in response to violence, not merely as a tool for expression, but also as part of a craft memory continuum at the intersection of collective solidarity, care, humanity, and action. Thank you very much for listening.